So we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. Here's those points to ponder that we talk about each time we have a lecture. Great questions to start off with if you're studying the PowerPoint. If you can answer those questions without looking, then you're most likely on the right track. So what is the cardiovascular system? If you had no idea, the first thing I would do is suggest is looking at the actual word itself. The root word of cardio, I think of, what somebody gets on a treadmill and does some cardio and what's going on with that. So when I see the word cardiovascular, I think of cardio, and then it starts to make me think of the heart. So this includes the heart and the blood vessels. It brings nutrients to and from the cells and helps get rid of waste. So you're thinking every single time you take a deep breath in and out, your carbon dioxide is coming out of your mouth or your nose, oxygen in your nose or your mouth. It's coming in through your lungs. It is then being put into your bloodstream, and your heart is then pumping it to your extremities and then back to the heart with the waste, and the waste is then excreted from your body either as carbon dioxide gas or through the urine. So it says blood is refreshed in the lungs, the kidneys, the intestine, and the liver. So when you think about, I always give the joke of like, you're out on a Saturday night and you're like, oh, my poor liver. Okay, you've maybe heard somebody say that before. That just means that there's probably some toxins in your blood, most likely alcohol. And what happens is, maybe you'll feel it the next day, but in a couple of days, you don't feel the effects of the alcohol anymore. And that's because your intestines, your lung, your kidneys, things like that, they help cleanse or refresh that blood in your body. So then we also have the lymphatic vessels. This helps by collecting excess fluid surrounding the tissues and returning it to the cardiovascular system. So this is the lymphatic vessels are going to help bring it back to that cardiovascular system by collecting that excess fluid that's surrounding those tissues. This is also maybe something you think of, like you sprain your ankle and you've got a bunch of swelling in your ankle. When I played college soccer, I sprained both of my ankles at the same time, but I still played. It was my senior year. I had 5 games left, and I was like, let's just tape me up. So they taped both my ankles. But your lymphatic vessels help get rid of that excess fluid that may be around surrounding something and bringing it back to that cardiovascular system. That cardiovascular system is what we want to use to get in the nutrients, take out the waste. So that's kind of the main thing here. So this is a picture in your book as well. If you can't see it that well on the PowerPoint, it's figure 5.1 in your book. This just is a diagram kind of showing 4 different types of things that are involved in that cardiovascular system to help with homeostasis. And we talked about what homeostasis is. Does anybody remember what homeostasis is? Let's kind of say homeostasis is. Monday afternoon. What is homeostasis? Can anyone answer that question? Yeah. And remind me of your name again, please. Peyton. Okay, Peyton in class said that it helps regulate your body temperature. That's good. That's one example of kind of what the main overlying thing that it does is that your homeostasis is keeping your internal organs normal as possible, right? We don't want to be too hot. We don't want to be too cold. We don't want to have excess of anything. We don't want to have depletion of anything. So we're trying to stay as normal as possible. So these are the different parts of the cardiovascular system that are helping us maintain that homeostasis. So you've got the respiratory system. This is we take in oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. You have different tissue cells. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about tissue cells. So when those tissue cells are taking in nutrients and excreting waste, then you have your food, your digestive system. All of those indigestible food reduces, become feces. And then you have metabolic waste through your kidneys and your urine. So this is how our body is maintaining energy and function. And speaking of function, what are the functions of the cardiovascular system? So we have regulation, protection, and transport. TPR is another way to kind of remember that. So we want to transport. We want to transport oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, hormones, waste. This is kind of like the railroad system of our body, right? We want to transport all of these things throughout the body. You want to because you don't want to get dizzy walking up the stairs, even though sometimes we do. We want oxygen to get to our extremities so that they get to our legs so that our lungs can pump oxygen. Protection. This is protecting the cells of the immune system. They are transported to help protect the body from infection. So when you get an infection, maybe that be an ear infection or you got a cut on your finger and it got infected, your blood system has white blood cells and helper T cells that are going to protect, and while you may have an infection for a short amount of time, it's not going to be life-threatening if you get a paper cut that gets infected on your finger. Some people who have problems with that or immunodeficiency, if they have immune deficiency disease, diabetes is another one of those that people have a little bit harder time using their blood system to help fight off infections. And then we have regulation, which we talked about, Peyton talked about with homeostasis. It's helping with a variety of conditions. So one of them being regulation of body temperature. One of them is regulating the energy efficiency of our body and things like that. Trying to keep our body staying as normal as possible. Okay, so what is the main pathway of blood in the body? So I'm going to try and draw it on both of the PowerPoints here at the same time, so wish me luck. We have the heart. Okay, so I like to, does it want to write? There we go. There's the heart. I probably could draw a better heart on the board, but we'll do it on here. So here's your heart. No, your heart does not actually look like that. I don't really like the one I drew on this PowerPoint. Okay, we've got your heart. You have your arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then it comes back to the heart. So another way to remember this is the way that I draw it, is I draw it going away from your heart. And then what I like to think of is you can go and look at an art gallery, right? You can go look at art on the wall. You can go look at a statue. That reminds me that arteries take blood away from the heart. You can look at that heart. So I'm going to just put art on the drawing here instead of trying to write out the word arteries and arterioles. But you guys should then know, or write it on your own piece of paper. Oopsies. I didn't do that on purpose. There we go. It's really hard to draw with this. Okay. And all right, so there we've got the arteries, the arterioles. Then we have the capillaries. So this is where we have that oxygen exchange. This is kind of where we start to have that connection with our lungs, because you're like, how do I get oxygen from my lungs to the bloodstream? So I'm just going to write cap, or I might just put a C, because it's the only thing with C. Okay. Then we have the venules and the veins. Has anybody seen the movie How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days? Yep. What song does she sing and she's on the stage? Anybody? You're so vain. What's this song about? You probably think this song is about you, right? So when you think of somebody being vain, you think of somebody who's very inward focused, very self-centered. That's the way I think of it, is when you think of a vein, it brings blood back to the heart. The venules and the veins. So I'm going to put venule and then veins. Let's see how good I am. I'm better on my laptop than I am on this one. Okay, so we've got the venules. Man, that looks like my first day. All right, and then veins. You probably think this song is about you. You're so vain. Okay. So that's how blood moves from your heart to your extremities and back to your heart. Okay, so the arteries, maybe you've heard of your aorta being that big valve on your heart. It's really big because we've got to be able to pump some blood to the rest of those extremities, right? It's also the reason why the left side of your heart is a lot bigger than your right, and we will talk about that in a second. Okay, so like it says, arteries carry blood away from the heart. Remember, you can go look at art. That's the way I think of that. Their walls have 3 layers. They have a thin inner epithelium. We talked about epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue is the one that lines and covers. They have a thick, smooth muscle layer. Okay, so now they have some smooth muscle tissue on there. Remember, smooth muscle tissue is that involuntary movement. We have outer connective tissue. We talked about what connective tissue is for. It's for supporting the fluid, the fibers. The arterioles are just small arteries that regulate blood pressure. Has anybody ever had their blood pressure taken before? Probably all of you, right? Then you probably know like what a high and a low blood pressure means. We'll talk a little bit about that. So these arterioles are just smaller arteries that are going to regulate that blood pressure. When somebody stands up really quickly, how do you think that that affects their blood pressure? Or you can even just tell me like what you think the symptoms would be. Yeah, you get dizzy. Why? So we're getting dizzy. What else happens when you stand up really fast? Like you're dizzy. You're doing some burpees really fast. That's not me though. Mine are pretty slow. Yeah, so you're dizzy. I think of like your vision kind of goes in and out a little bit. You kind of start to get that like tunnel vision and not in a good way. So when your blood pressure changes rapidly, that's when you feel those effects. That's also an indication of whether someone is ill or not. That's why when you go to get a checkup at the doctor, they check your blood pressure almost every single time. We'll talk more about blood pressure here in the second half of the slides. Okay, so now we have the capillaries. These are microscopic vessels between the arterioles and the venules. So remember that little heart diagram I drew? We've got the arterioles, we've got the capillaries, and then we have the venules. I think of the capillaries as kind of looking like a bird's nest of like branching, and I'll show you a picture in the next slide. They're made of 1 layer of epithelial tissue. They form beds, so they're called the capillary beds. And I think of it like a bird's nest, like a bed of vessels where exchange with body cells occurs. So this is how we're getting that oxygen to and from our lungs, essentially. And it's combined with large surface area. All right, so we talked about what epithelial tissue is for. Good, so here's a picture. This is figure 5.2 in your book. It's on page 93. So that purpley kind of color in the middle, that's that bird's nest like bed that I was kind of talking about. You have the artery in red. There's some connective tissue kind of being described here. And then you have the vein in blue. So this picture is accurate, but why do you think they have the artery in red and the vein in blue? Good question. Okay, maybe could you guys look for me, I have pretty transparent skin here on my hand. When I look at your veins on your hand or maybe your arm, what color are they? Are they bright red? No, what color are they? They're blue. So when oxygen is or when blood is oxygen rich, meaning that it has a lot of oxygen, like when somebody's rich with money, you can be oxygen rich, it turns that bright red color. So when we want oxygen to our extremities, to our toes, to our elbows, to our fingers. So the artery is bright red in this picture, in this diagram, because the blood in your arteries is rich in oxygen, so we can send it to the rest of your body. Then when you're done using it, this happens really fast. It's not as slow as I'm describing it. So maybe I used the blood to shut my book. Okay, now I'm done using that blood to shut my book. We have to get all that waste away, so that carbon dioxide, all that waste. When it comes back, it's not oxygen rich anymore, and it turns into a bluish purple color. Okay. It talks about how the arteries have a layer of smooth muscle tissue. This is important because we need to kind of shoot that blood to the rest of your extremities. It's also why when you do a handstand, you don't just pass out, right? Okay, yeah, after you do a handstand for like 3 minutes, maybe you'll start to get dizzy, but your body actually can fight and push blood against the gravity. It's not just kind of always going down like you would think it would. It also has to go up to your brain too, right? So we have to have some sort of muscle tissue to do the action there. Totally off topic again, but my boyfriend does CrossFit, and he was like watching the CrossFit games this weekend or something on his phone, and they were supposed to do like a 3-minute handstand. I don't know if anybody's into CrossFit, probably not, but I just thought that was interesting. Okay. We've got veins and venules. Remember, you're so vain, you're self-centered, which means that that blood is coming back to your heart from your extremities. The venules are just those small veins that receive blood from the capillaries. Okay, so those capillaries are between the venules and the arterioles. The venule and the vein have walls of 3 layers. Okay, they also have a thin inner epithelium, a thick, smooth muscle layer, and other connective tissue. Okay, so they did also have to have some muscle tissue on the veins there because we're pumping blood in the opposite direction of gravity, most likely, unless you're doing a handstand, right? Veins carry blood towards the heart. So all of your veins, if you've heard you have a certain type of vein, maybe you have a good vein. Veins are the ones that go back to your heart. They carry blood against gravity, like I just said, and they have valves to keep the blood flowing towards the heart. So they have some sort of opening, kind of like a dam in a river, that is going to allow that flow towards the heart. All right, and this next picture is the same thing I was talking about before. How can we tell the difference between an artery and a vein? The biggest way is by color. Okay, an artery is going to be bright red, oxygen rich. You can also think of it as, when you think of the word art, I know art is subjective to what art actually means, but you can think of it as like bright, a beautiful picture, bright. That makes me think of oxygen rich blood. It's a bright red color. And then your veins are oxygen poor, so they don't have as much oxygen in them, and they turn like a bluish purple color. So the biggest difference you can tell between an artery and a vein is the color. You can also tell by the size and the location, but the biggest difference would be color. So here's a little bit about the anatomy of the heart. On the test, I don't put a picture that you have to label. Okay, as you can tell in the last test, I didn't put a big cell on there and make you label the parts of the cell. I don't think that's an effective use of your time or mine. So what I like to test or kind of know about is more of the functional side. So there's obviously, in this next slide here, I'll show you, then we'll go back to the other slide. There's a lot of parts to the heart, right? And if you were maybe going to change your major because you just found this class so exciting, and you wanted to go on and take A&P, I teach A&P at Hawkeye Community College, and they have to learn all the parts. So we don't need to learn the parts, but you do maybe need to understand like how blood flows through the heart, because that's functional. So it goes from the left pulmonary artery to the blah, 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 and it goes all the way down, and we'll talk about that. So don't get worried so much about the picture. Maybe the picture can help you study and give you a reference point, but you won't have to label a picture. Okay, so the anatomy of the heart. So it's a large muscular organ. Yes, the heart is a muscular organ. It consists of mostly cardiac tissue, which makes sense, right? We're in the cardiac system. It has cardiac tissue, and it's called myocardium. That tissue is called myocardium. It is surrounded by a sac called the pericardium. Again, both of those root words having the word cardi in it, not like Cardi B, cardio. Consists of two sides. It has a left side and a right side, and it's separated by a septum. When we think of the way we define our heart, we have to think about the anatomical view, okay? So if I were to be looking at a heart on a table, because we will dissect a pig heart in this class, when we have a heart on the table and you're looking at it just like the picture on the next slide, anatomical view is as if it's in your person. So the right side of the heart would be my right side. So on the right side of my heart, if you were to put that down on the table, it's actually your left side. Okay? It consists of 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. It has 2 sets of valves. It has a semilunar valve and an atrioventricular valve. So those are also called the SV and the AV valves. And the valves produce the lub-dub sounds of the heart. So when you maybe got your, you went to a checkup and the doctor listened to your heart, that lub-dub that you hear, those are those valves that are closing and shutting and allowing for the blood to go to our extremities against gravity, to our extremities against gravity, most of the time. So when I talk about that, the anatomical view, anatomical just meaning in anatomy and physiology, how we label things. So the left and the right on this heart is actually the opposite to you guys, right? So the, I'm going to show here on Zoom first, and then I'll show the other one. So you have your left ventricle as one of those things, but your left side for the person looking or viewing at that is here, right? But the left ventricle is actually right here. Okay, let me show on. So when it says left ventricle here, if you follow that across, it's actually on your right side when you're looking at that. Do you see that? So we have to remember that it's as if it's in my body right now, right? So this is my left ventricle, but as soon as I lay it on the table to look at it, this is still my left ventricle, but it's on my right-hand side. So that's kind of something that people kind of have a hard time conceptualizing, because the lefts and the rights are flipped here when you're looking at it. So if you have a heart laid down on the table, remember your left and your rights are flipped, okay? That septum that separates the left and right, I don't think they have that labeled on this one. They might on the next one. Then we have the apex, kind of looks like my name, Alex. That's why I remember that one pretty well. It's kind of like that lobe on the bottom of the heart. This is also figure 5.3 in your book. So as you can see, all of the left labeled things are over here. The right atrium is right here. The right ventricle is here. Oh, I forget that you guys can't see what I'm doing here. So the right ventricle is here. Left atrium, right atrium, left ventricle, we already showed that. The other way to remember it, and I'll show you on the next slide too, which one is the atrium and which one is the ventricle. I remember it because in the alphabet, A comes before V. So on top, it's left Left atrium, right atrium. Left ventricle, right ventricle. Okay, so here's the internal anatomy of the heart. So essentially they made a superior cut down the top through the middle. So they kind of made a cut like this through the heart. So now we can see a little bit better that atrium. Why would the left atrium be smaller than the right atrium? Anybody know why there's a size difference there? Why is that right side of the heart bigger? I'll give you 2 clues. So part of our heart has to pump blood to the extremities, and part of our heart has to take blood back in. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Macy.
Does the right side pump the blood to the rest of the body?
It does, yep. So the right side pumps the blood to the rest of the body. That's why it's a little bit bigger. It's more muscular on that side. When you go to dissect a heart in class, that'll also be a great kind of reference point for you to figure out which is the front and which is the back and which is, you know, the left and the right, because that right side is going to look a little bit bigger. You can see that on the picture here. You got a lot of meat and dense muscle right there on that right side, you know, right side over here. And then on the left side, it's just a little bit smaller. But we want a pressure change in order to be able to function as normal. The chordae tendineae is kind of a cool word to say if you're ever bored. Chordae tendineae. It kind of looks like this branching in between the atrium and the ventricle. Right, we have the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary arteries, left and right. So left pulmonary artery, the pulmonary trunk, left pulmonary valve. If I can do this right. So those are some important ones. That septum, which was what I was looking for in the previous picture, that is what separates the left and the right side of the heart. A good way to remember that is it looks like the word separate, right? Septum, separate. We have that superior vena cava. That's the top part of your heart when we go to dissect. The aorta is the biggest because it's going to pump blood to the rest of the body. So this is a pretty good picture. I'm trying to think. So we got the right ventricle, the pulmonary muscles in there. Then we have the inferior vena cava. So when we talk about anatomy and physiology, when something is superior, it means it's on top, just like a superior in your workplace. Inferior vena cava just means it's below. Okay, so how does blood flow through the heart? So we already know that it goes from the heart to the arteries, to the arterioles, to the capillaries, to the venules, to the veins, back to the heart. How does it flow when we go through the heart? So there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on the chart here on the PowerPoint. But I want you to be aware that the number 1 is on the bottom because this is a cycle. It says blood will be pumped back to each vena cava. So blood can come in through either of the vena cavas, superior or inferior. And that's why it says both up here at the top, inferior and superior vena cava. They dump the blood into the right atrium. Okay, we're going to work from right to left. We work from atrium to ventricle. We then go to the pulmonary arteries. They lead the pulmonary arteries, and I'll show you a quick picture and then we'll go back. The pulmonary arteries are here. I'm going to show on this. So the pulmonary arteries we use to be able to pump blood to our lungs, where the blood becomes oxygenated, kind of like going to the shopping mall, right? You need, or even Target, right? You got to go get what you need. We need some oxygen, so we go to the lungs. Then we go to the pulmonary veins. Remember, so arteries go away from the heart. Pulmonary vein brings it back in. We bring that blood from the lungs back to the left atrium. Okay, I'm going to go back to that slide here. So remember where that left atrium is. It's right here. I'm kind of trying to highlight it. I hope you can see it. Right in there. On the slide here for the Zoom folk, it's right in here. That's that left atrium. Here are those left pulmonary veins that are going to, so now our blood is oxygenized. We went to the lungs, we went to Target, got what we needed. Now we can go from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Is large and muscular to pump blood to the aorta and the rest of the body. Eventually the blood will be pumped back to that vena cava and we do it all over again. So if the question asks where does blood get oxygenated, the word would be lungs. And then what do we use to go to and from the lungs? To the lungs, we use the pulmonary arteries. From the lungs, we use the pulmonary veins. So maybe if it makes more sense, you can redraw that diagram we did with the heart, and it says art, capillaries, things like that. Maybe you could add a little bit to that to help your understanding. So here's that diagram again, to kind of reference the different points here. Another thing about cardiac tissue, the gap junctions we have are called intercalculated discs, which we'll show in a different slide here, but that's what makes them unique, is they have those intercalculated discs. How does the structure of vessels and heart match their functions? So that left ventricle is more muscular than the right ventricle because it must pump blood to the entire body. The arteries are more muscular than veins to withstand the higher pressure to exert on them, and the veins have a thinner wall and a larger center to contain blood. Let's go back up to that first one. That left ventricle is more muscular than that right ventricle because it must pump blood to the entire body. So here we've got all this muscle in here. And I think I may have said that backwards before, and I apologize if I did. But here's all that muscle on that left ventricle that's going to be used to pump it to the rest of the body. I'm going to show that on the slide here. There's all that muscle. Then we also have the arteries that are more muscular than veins to withstand the higher pressure exerted on them. Okay, I think of this, so arteries have more pressure than veins. So that's because our body is demanding oxygen to the extremities, and we have to kind of exert that pressure on our arteries to get the blood to go to our extremities. Think about it like if you're going for a run or you're walking up the stairs, or maybe you're, I don't know, sitting and thinking during a test, right? Your extremities need that oxygen, so there's more pressure to push it to those extremities than there is to bring the waste back to the heart. And finally, the veins have a thinner wall and a larger center to contain the blood. They have a thinner wall. So how does that heartbeat occur? Maybe you've heard of the word systole and diastole before. This is the two different numbers when you're thinking of your blood pressure. So The systole is when the atria contract together, followed by the ventricles contracting together. So remember that lub lub, lub lub, or lub dub, I guess you could say, of the heart. The systole is when the atria contract together, dun dun, and then followed by the ventricles contracting together, dun dun. This is followed by a distal or rest phase when the chambers relax. So you'll see on like an ECG or EKG, and maybe if you've watched Grey's Anatomy or if you've watched any like hospital shows, you'll hear the beep, beep of the heart. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then you guys obviously know what happens when it goes beep, right? Okay. This is that cardiac cycle or a heartbeat. It occurs about 70 times per minute on average. This is also called your resting heart rate. So let's have a little bit of an interactive class. So what I want you to do is we're going to take our heart rate. Now I know most of you maybe have an Apple Watch or a smartwatch of some sort. Let's not look at it right now. Let's compare and see what we've got. So you can either take your you can do 2 or 3 fingers on your wrist, but if you can't feel that, I feel it best on my neck, even though I know that it's not the most appropriate place to take your blood or your heart rate because of the vibrations of when you're talking, so I have to stop talking to do that. I'm going to time us for 15 seconds. I want you to count how many beats you get in those 15 seconds. Okay, ready, set, go. Time. So take that number times 4, and that is your resting heart rate. Normally what you could do is count for 60 seconds because that would be your beats per minute. But we just did 15 seconds, so you take that times 4. Does anybody feel comfortable sharing what they got? Yeah.
67.
67, 66. Yeah, so the average is about 70. You'll see a lot of like endurance runners or like elite athletes have a super low resting heart rate, especially like I said, endurance runners, cross country runners, even some track runners, because of how much of cardiovascular shape that they're in. Their body is very efficient. Remember, the goal of our body is to stay alive, right? Ha ha ha, staying alive. Pumping blood to our extremities, breathing in oxygen, like these are our main goals of our body. So if we can be more efficient with that and have less energy in order to do that, our body can maybe withstand a little bit more. So that's a little bit about resting heart rate and that systole and diastole and what those mean. It says, what is the cardiac cycle? That's essentially how blood is pumped through our heart to the extremities and then back into our heart. And we talked a little bit about that. And a cycle is just implying that it happens over and over again. And it happens faster than the way I can explain it, right? Every single time you hear the thud of your heart, it's going out, in, out, in. And then when you're working out, you're going upstairs, you're out for a run, your heart rate increases, right? We have more activity. We're going to have to get blood to our extremities so that, our legs don't feel numb while we're running, even though maybe that would be somewhat beneficial sometimes. You want to have the blood to your extremities. That's that cycle. It's going to keep happening. That's why we raise our heart rate in order to, when we're doing some sort of activity. It's also like our fight or flight, our adrenaline. So maybe somebody said something to you that made you really upset, right? You maybe start to sweat or you maybe start to stress about it. That's still your body having a physical reaction. Your heart rate may increase. They say people who are more stressed have a higher heart rate. That makes sense, right? And they also say that stress has physical effects. And it's just essentially as if you were going for a run, but you're not meaning to. So how is that heartbeat controlled? So we have to have some sort of control system. There's an internal control, and then there's an external control on the next slide. So this internal control is that SA node. It's in the right atrium, and it indicates or initiates the heartbeat and causes the atria to contract. Does anybody know what an AED is? What's an AED?
The machine that it'll shock the heart for you if someone like goes into cardiac arrest.
Yeah, if anybody's taken a first aid class, or maybe you've walked by some public place that has an AED. We don't have an AED in here, but we have a first aid kit. There's probably an AED in this building. For code, I could not tell you where it is. It's probably maybe up by Ruth's office. But what an AED does is exactly what Haley was saying here, is that it shocks the heart. It sends an electrical signal that normally is initiated by the SA node to contract that heart. When you do CPR, that's just a manual way to contract that atria. It then reaches the AV node, also in the right atrium, to send a signal down the AV bundle and the Purkinje fibers that causes the ventricular contraction. Well, there's a lot of words there, okay? So we're going from the SA node to the AV node, and our goal is to create a contraction. When you think about moving your knee back and forth, what it does to your quad and your hamstring, one is contracting while one is relaxing. We want to create that contraction of the heart, kind of like a sponge, so that we can push the blood and the oxygen to our extremities. These impulses travel between the gap junctions that are unique to the cardiac system, called intercalculated discs. So here's the external control. So earlier, that last slide, that was inside of the heart. This is on the outside of the heart. The heartbeat is also controlled by the cardiac center in the brain and hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Is anybody familiar with EpiPens? What's in an EpiPen? I'm going to give you a hint. You got two options in there up there. What's in an EpiPen? Which one? Epinephrine. And when do we use an EpiPen? Or when would somebody need an EpiPen?
Stop an allergic reaction, or to be something that stops it to halt it for a period of time.
Yes. So you gave two really good points. You use it when somebody's having an allergic reaction. Most people who have an EpiPen know they have an EpiPen and know they have an allergy of some sort. Maybe that's to bee stings or peanuts or something. Usually you can stick it right in the upper thigh. And then the symptoms of that allergic reaction, maybe that was throat swelling, swelling of the face, it goes down. But does that mean that we're just done? No. Sam was saying that it goes down for a little bit. So when you use an EpiPen, you have about like 30 minutes to get that person to a licensed professional, like a doctor or an EMT, because the epinephrine will wear off. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are also what happens in our fight or flight. Okay, so when trying to think of an example. I've used this example before, but I'm going to use it again. So we heard there was a global pandemic, right? We went into fight or flight mode, right? Everybody went to Target and Walmart and Costco and bought all the toilet paper, right? They decided to fight it out. They didn't fly away. Fight or flight is our animal, our mammalian response to something. Fight or flight is also the reason why maybe when you're driving, you can make a quick reaction if you are alert and ready that you didn't even think of, right? Your body's fight or flight is protecting you. So it also goes back to like animals. Maybe animals are a better example of this. If an invader comes into your territory, maybe you're a bear or a bird, you have two options, right? You're either going to fight that intruder or you're going to fly away. So that's your fight or flight. Maybe if you've taken a psychology class, you understand that. That's also that epinephrine, right? These are two different hormones that are affecting, making physical effects in our body. It's affecting whether or not how big of a dilation our heart and our veins and our arteries are and things like that. So that's a kind of a way that it's externally controlled. So our heart can be externally controlled by hormones. It's also like when I say when you get stressed or things like that, you're kind of maybe a little anxious, maybe your heart rate increases, or maybe you start to sweat or things like that. Those are also those hormones. So here's a visualization of that heart. It's just showing the SA and the AV nodes. It's showing the branches of the arterioventricular bundle and those Purkinje fibers. This is just figure 5-6A in your book. You don't need to memorize that. The next slide is also just showing those intercalculated discs. They are a certain type of gap junctions that is unique to the cardiac system. It's how the tissue cells communicate with each other and how the oxygen and the waste are intake and exhaled respectively. So the next slide is called an ECG, and maybe you've heard of this before. The ECG stands for electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram. ECG. Electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram. This is a record of the electrical changes in the heart muscle during a cardiac cycle. This is that same thing I was talking about with Grey's Anatomy. You see the little beeps on the screen? That's that ECG. I think also one of the new Apple Watches does this for you. I'm not that fancy. I don't have that. But the atria produce an electrical current called the P wave when stimulated by the SA node. So we have that SA node. It makes a P wave, and I'm going to show you a picture on the next slide. And then it goes in the order of the alphabet, which is super helpful. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, P wave, and it goes Q, R, S, T, right? So that's the same pattern as the alphabet, P, Q, R, S, T. Then we go through from the P wave to the Q, R, S, and then the T, which is what it shows here. I'll do that, P, Q, R, S, and then T. It's helpful that they did that in the same order as the alphabet. It probably was on purpose. And then looking at these electrical changes allows the doctors to detect abnormalities. So maybe somebody can see an irregular heartbeat with this. Maybe they can see sometimes there's an extra beat and things like that. That would still be considered irregular. But let's show a picture of that here on the next slide. So you have a graph on the right-hand side that has that PQRST. So it goes PQRST. Okay, it goes in the order of the alphabet. So we have the electrical current that is contracting in order to get blood to the extremities. It comes back from the extremities. It goes back to normal over that T wave when we start again. So it goes P, Q, extremities, back, in. Okay? The thud is the thud and then thud. The R and the S are that lub-dub sound that you hear. That's the different valves opening and closing. We talked a little bit about blood pressure, but here's a little bit more. So that systolic, the systolic pressure is the highest pressure. So that's that big number when they tell you your blood pressure. Maybe you have a blood pressure of 120/80. That would be fairly normal. That number 120 on the top is that systolic pressure. It's during the blood ejection from the heart. Okay, we want or yeah, blood 120 over 80. I was right on that number. It is in milligrams of mercury. The systolic and the diastolic. So that diastolic is the 80. That's that diastolic pressure. This occurs when the ventricles relax. So the dud relax. That's that diastolic pressure. That's the 80. That's a little bit less. We'll show in a table in a couple of the slides here about what it means if you have hypertension or an irregular blood pressure. Remember that this is controlled by the arterioles. So we're still talking about blood pressure. This is a blood pressure cuff. Then you have a gauge here on the bottom. You have the systole and the diastole are the sounds heard when the artery is opening. And then there's no sound heard when the artery is open. So once it's open, it makes a noise, but while it's open, it does not make a noise. So that's also why when you're at the doctor and they're taking your blood pressure, sometimes they also put a stethoscope on your arm or wherever that is. So they're listening to that artery opening and closing to detect any abnormalities. The next one, how is blood pressure characterized? The normal values for an adult would be a little bit different than a child. The top number, remember, is that systolic. If you have less than 95, it's considered hypotension, HYPO. If you have higher than 139, you start to get into that pre-hypertension, but then you get into that stage 1 of hypertension, HYPER. Instead of hypo, it's hyper. And then hypertension is when we start to have a few issues. You can have hypertension throughout your day, and it's no big deal. It's when it starts to be your regular blood pressure where that's an issue. They also call this like white coat syndrome. So when you go to the doctor, maybe you're a little bit nervous because you got to get your flu shot or something, and you're sitting there, and they take your blood pressure, and it's like 135 over 80. Okay. So that would technically be in the pre-hypertension, but I'm pretty sure that if you're a normal, healthy human, that you're not in pre-hypertension, you're probably just nervous to be at the doctor. So they call that white coat syndrome. So sometimes it's better if they also have those, well, maybe you won't want to use them right now with COVID, but they have them like at Hy-Vee or Walmart where you can go get your own blood pressure checked, and maybe that's a little bit more low-key for someone if they have a frequency of kind of being nervous to get their blood pressure taken, and it ends up kind of being a little bit more spiked than usual. That bottom number, that diastolic, it stays a little bit more constant, but again, you're trying to look for normal being around 120 or below, and then 80 or below, but you don't want to get lower than 95 or lower than 50, or you start to get into that hypotension. So what is important about blood flow? That we are under the highest pressure of blood when it's in the arteries, and that is because of the thick muscular walls. Remember, we can go out and look at art. This is going to our extremities. Blood flow is slower in the capillaries, which is important to allow time for exchange between cells. So this process is faster than you think it is, but the capillaries I think of, and I'll show you in this next slide, it looks kind of like a bird's nest. Remember, it's like a bed. And that exchange of molecules or gases between those cells is going to take a little bit more time, which is kind of important. Blood pressure is minimal in the veins and venules, but blood flow increases. So that's just talking about the difference when your blood pressure, not just the number that we took and we recorded at the doctor, but the actual pressure of your blood in the veins and the venules. So the capillaries are that middle part here that I keep describing. I think this is one of the better pictures. It's right there in the middle. It's kind of that purpley color. And I keep going like this because it kind of looks like branching web-like, kind of like a spider web. They call it a capillary bed. Okay. This graph does a really good job of kind of showing what happens with our blood pressure and the velocity of the blood. So on the bottom of this graph here, this is the blood flow starting in the heart. So this is kind of like over time, blood flow over time here on the bottom. And then we have the relative magnitude or the intensity of something, and we're going to be looking at it here. If I can draw anything, wow, that was really bad. I'm embarrassed. Okay, here, highlighted. Okay. The blood pressure in the arteries is fairly high and intense. This is because we are pumping blood to the rest of our body, which is right here. Then we go to our arterioles, and then we get into the capillaries. We then have a total cross-sectional area of vessels, and our blood pressure, it goes down a little bit when it comes back into our veins. So we kind of have this intense, and then we slow down, and it goes through that cycle again. Intense, and then it slows down, and it slows down through those capillaries. So the other question is we said that the blood pressure, so the amount of pressure on the veins, I think of it like a circle and there's pressure pushing on the outside. The pressure of the veins is low. So why does the blood flow increase? So the reason for this is that they have help. So the veins have help from the skeletal muscles contracting, breathing from your lungs, that pressure change, and also the valves that are opening and closing, allowing you to go against gravity. So the thing is, it's like, why is the blood pressure so low, but I have to fight gravity from my quad muscle to my heart because we're going in the opposite direction of gravity. Why would that blood pressure be lower, but the blood flow increase? We're using skeletal muscles, like I said, breathing, and the valves that are allowing us to go against gravity, even though our blood pressure is lower. There are two different pathways in the cardiovascular system in the body. You have the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is the right side of the heart that brings blood from the body to the heart and lungs. So remember, we go right atrium, right ventricle. We go to the pulmonary arteries that go to our lungs, and we have the pulmonary veins, comes back from the lungs. That's that pulmonary circuit. It's going from the right side of the heart, bringing the blood from the body to the heart and the lungs. Then we have the systemic circuit. This is the left side of the heart that brings blood to the entire body to deliver nutrients and get rid of waste. So this is from the capillaries to the extremities, then back in through the ventricles and the veins, bringing that blood back to the heart. So those are the two different cardiovascular pathways in the body. This is just another picture in your book, bless you, page 92. No, wait, not 92. Very similar picture on 92. This is on 103. This is a picture of 511, the major arteries and veins of the systemic circuit. So this is one of those two pathways, the pulmonary and the systemic. This is the veins of the systemic circuit, so the ones that are going all the way around our bodies. It's also, like I said, from your fingers and your toes, your knees, your neck, your head, all the rest of your body. It's a good reference point. Okay, so the heart's blood supply, we have coronary circulation. These are small coronary arteries that supply the heart. They are separate from the systemic and the pulmonary pathways of the body. You don't really need to know that one, so I'm going to move on. We don't need to know what that is. Okay, so on to the next one. Exchange at the capillary beds is primarily a result of osmotic and blood pressure. So when the blood pressure is changing, there is a release of certain molecules or water, osmotic, that allows for the exchange between those capillary beds. So on the arterial end, so the artery end, we're leaving the heart from the heart. That's why it says from the heart here. Going away from the heart, we're going to the arteries. The blood pressure is high. Remember, we've got to get our extremities, the oxygen, so the blood pressure is higher than the osmotic pressure. So the net pressure is out. So it's forcing the molecules out, which kind of makes sense, right? We want to take that oxygen and we want it to go out into the rest of our body. You've got water, salt, some plasma proteins in there, oxygen, amino acids, glucose, carbon dioxide, waste, and water. Notice the arrows. So this is what they want you to notice in this picture here. The osmotic pressure is the green arrow, and the blood pressure is the red arrow. So you have green arrows here. If I can draw here, if you guys can kind of see that maybe. There's the green arrows. When the osmotic pressure is higher on the right, the net pressure is in. So we want it to be filtered back in on our way to the heart. So this is kind of a good diagram to understand how the osmotic and the blood pressure relate to each other. They are opposites. And then in the middle, we don't have any net movement as much. That's where they slow down. So when that osmotic pressure is low and the blood pressure is high, that means that we have a net movement out. When we have a net movement in is when the osmotic is high and the blood pressure is low. Talking more about the exchange through the capillaries, there's a good picture on the next slide. The lymphatic capillary beds lie alongside the capillary beds. So these are within the capillary beds. I'm going to show you on the next slide really quick so you can get a visualization. Those are the kind of greenish gray color in the middle. Those are the lymphatic capillary. When the lymphatic capillaries take up excess fluid, it becomes lymph. Not limp, lymph. Kind of hard to say with a mask on. Lymph returns to the cardiovascular veins in the chest. This is the pre-capillary sphincters that can shut down at a blood capillary, and blood then flows through the shunt. So that last point is a little bit hard to understand, but essentially this lymph is important for fighting off infections. Lymph is a fluid, and here's a picture in the next slide of the arterioles and the venules. The capillary bed, remember it looks like a bird's nest in the middle. You have the tissue cells that are kind of surrounding it and around the outside. Those are all tissue cells. These are all tissue cells. You have the lymphatic capillary, which is that greenish gray color right here. You have a blood capillary, which is in purple. So a blood capillary is ones that are between the artery and the vein, so the arterial and the venule. Then you have the a lymphatic duct, just essentially where things are stored or placed. And then you have that venule over here. So this is just between the arterial and the venule that's talking about that exchange to the capillaries where that osmotic pressure and the blood pressure kind of are moving back and forth with each other. Okay, we've got a little bit, it says 13 slides left, so like 10 to 13 slides left, so stick with me here. We're doing great on time. The last couple of slides are a little bit more applicable to real life. Maybe you've heard of someone who has a cardiovascular disease. One of the most common ones being heart attack and stroke. And we're going to talk about those. So it says, why should we care about cardiovascular disease? Well, it's the most common cause of death in the Western world. Can anybody give me an idea of like why it would be the most common in the Western world?
Lifestyle.
Yeah, the lifestyle. Think about it. We can go down to McDonald's and get a large sweet tea or Coke for $1. That's a steal, right? That's a good deal right there. But how much sugar or things like that is in that large supersized drink, soda drink, okay? while it's fun to treat yourself once in a while, and trust me, I have pop like once or twice a week or things like that as well. But it's fun to treat yourself. The lifestyle, the accessibility we have to food, the cheapness of the junk food. You go to the grocery store and you're like, okay, I'm going to eat healthy this week, and you buy some broccoli and some sort of protein and maybe some salad, and your bill's like $15. And you go and you get some Cheez-Its and some Doritos, and your bill is $6. Right? So it costs more money to eat healthy. The accessibility, I mean, you can pretty much, even during a global pandemic, go down to either a gas station or the grocery store, and pretty much anything you want is at the tip of your fingers. It's right there. You just have to be able to pretty much afford it. And then we have the option where it's like, well, you know, do you want the large drink instead of the small? It's only 50 cents different. And you're like, 50 cents? That's no big deal. I'll get that. Or supersized fries. So the Western world, I think it was Barbara who spoke up in the Zoom, it is the lifestyle, right? It's not the same in other countries, in the Eastern countries of the world, but West and East is relative. So these are considered the disorders of the blood vessels. So these are all different types of cardiovascular diseases. I said a little bit about the heart attack and stroke. Those are maybe some common words that you recognize. There's hypertension, which we talked about when we talked about blood pressure and having a high blood pressure. Having a high blood pressure for a long amount of time really wears and tears on your heart. That's why blood pressure is super important, and it's why it gets checked frequently at the doctor's office. And you can also get it checked at a pharmacy too. It wears and tears on your heart. If you have a higher blood pressure, your heart is working really hard for a long period of time, and it's just wearing down faster. It's not as efficient. Arteriosclerosis, this is hard to say with a mask on because my thing is falling down. Arteriosclerosis, we'll talk about in a second. We have stroke, heart attack, and then we have an aneurysm. You've probably heard of most of these words before, so let's just talk about them briefly. Like I said, hypertension, that's when we have a number of 140 over 90 when you take your blood pressure, but I'm talking about consistently, right? Not that white coat syndrome. This is the silent killer because there are few symptoms. It's not like you have chest pain when you have a high blood pressure. You may after a long period of time, but sitting here right now without checking everybody's blood pressure, you can't feel your blood pressure. So that's why it's kind of a silent killer is what it says. It can lead to a heart attack, stroke, or kidney failure because the pressure changes in our heart are off because they're not normal, and our heart is having to work harder than usual, and it gets tired. This is arteriosclerosis. This is that plaque buildup in the blood vessels, and there's a really good picture on the next slide, so bear with me. This is when that plaque is stationary, and it's called a thrombus, and an embolus, which is when it detaches and can move to distant sites. It is associated with stroke, heart attack, and aneurysm. It's kind of like a blockage, like a roadblock on the drive, right? This is like driving through Iowa in the summer. There's always construction. Right? It takes you longer to get to and from when you're driving down 380. Trying to get from Waterloo to Cedar Rapids, there's always road construction, right? This is the same thing. We've got some sort of blockage here that is preventing the blood from getting pumped effectively. There are different types. So that fat or cholesterol, that's why people don't want a high saturated fat diet or high cholesterol diet when people are worried about that. That's because they don't want to clog their arteries or their blood vessels or veins. This is a picture of a coronary artery with the fat and the cholesterol making up that plaque buildup. Essentially, that's just that roadblock. If it gets entirely blocked or not enough blood or oxygen got to the extremities, that's when we see problems with stroke and heart attack. A stroke, which we'll talk about here next, is when the blood oxygen is not getting to your brain. This is also called cerebrovascular accident, CVA, It says it usually occurs when a cranial artery is blocked or burst, and then the oxygen doesn't get to a part of your brain. A stroke doesn't necessarily mean that the person will die. Many people have recovered from strokes. There's a lot of wide spectrum of a stroke. Maybe it means that they have some sort of motor or cognitive skills that have to be therapeutically redone, maybe through occupational therapy. Or sometimes they have some sort of disorders the rest of their life just because a certain part of their brain was damaged. We also talked about that with nervous tissue. Nervous tissue can't regenerate. You can't make new brain cells. You can't make new nerve cells. That's also when people joke around like on Saturday night, like, hey, let's go kill our brain cells. Well, yeah, you can't really get any of those back. Like how your skin cells come back every 2 weeks. The skin that we're looking at right now is different than when we started class, right? Your skin cells are always rejuvenating every 2 weeks, very fast. Nerve cells don't do that. So when we have a stroke, we cut off that oxygen from the brain, we have some sort of damage, and it depends where it's at and how extensive it is. That's the symptoms of the stroke, or like the consequences of a stroke. When somebody may be having a stroke, some of the symptoms you could see are numbness of the hands and face, so that numbness, that tingly feeling. They may have difficulty speaking or an inability to see in one eye. You can also sometimes see it like a droopiness in one side of the face. That's because our body is broken up into halves, the left and the right half of our body. And it's why I can do one thing with this hand and do something else with the hand. You know what I mean? Can everybody do the whole like tap your head and pat your belly in a different direction? Anybody know how to do that? That's the same reason why you can do two different things with your hands, because it's two different sides of your brain working. So if we have some sort of damage happening to a certain part of our brain, maybe you start to see a droopiness in one side of their face. That's why it's only in one side and not both. So it just depends where that stroke is happening. Heart attack is fairly common. It's also known as a myocardial infraction, MI. You don't really need to call it that. This is a part where the heart essentially dies due to a lack of oxygen. I have a 95-year-old grandma who had a 4 bypass surgery and she's still kicking, and that was 12 years ago. So like heart attacks, they have so much advanced medicine now that most people can come back from that. And then we have the angina, the pectoris. It begins with a pain in your chest and it radiates down your left arm due to blockage in that coronary arteries. That's when somebody is specifically saying maybe they have a tingliness in their right arm or a numbness pain kind of feeling in their left arm. That can be a sign of a heart attack too. So those are just some of those things that you can look out for. And most of the time, early detection is key. Getting into an EMT or a hospital as soon as possible. An aneurysm is a ballooning of the blood vessel. So this is when atherosclerosis and hypertension can weaken a vessel and cause ballooning. So we've got some plaque buildup, we've got some high blood pressure. So it's kind of like when you go to the water park and somebody is going down a slide with a tube, and the tube gets stuck, and then it like starts to, everybody backs up their tube at the water park, and then this is kind of frustrating. I don't know if this is a good example or not, but that's what I'm thinking in my head. And then all of a sudden it causes it to burst, right? So the blood vessel or the vein can't take that pressure any longer of the plaque in the high blood pressure pushing on the walls of the veins and the arteries. And this is when it's called an aneurysm. This is most commonly affected is in the abdominal artery or the arteries leading to the brain. So if somebody has a brain aneurysm, that can be very serious. It's a more severe stroke because you have an actual burst. Also, if you have an aneurysm in your abdomen, that is also from an aneurysm. All right, so how are disorders of the blood vessels treated? You can do this by dissolving blood clots. TPA is a drug that dissolves blood clots. There's also things called blood thinners. If you think about what it means to thin the blood, essentially, if you don't have as thick as blood, it won't be as hard to push it through that high blood pressure and that plaque. Treating clogged arteries, you can have bypass surgery. That's what I said. I think of it as like if there's a construction zone and you have to go through a detour, and maybe you have a road here and you've got to kind of get from point A to point B, and there's some blockage here. You got to get there somehow. So bypass is when they bypass. They use a vein from your leg and they take it to make a bypass, and they bypass that clogged part. So maybe I should draw a picture of that here. Okay, so here's maybe some of that plaque, fat, cholesterol buildup. A bypass would be that they use a vein from your leg to go around that to continue to maintain that blood pumping. So my grandma was talking about, she had 4 bypass. Well, that's what she says. I thought it was 6, but 6 would have been a lot. So she says it was 4 bypass surgery. Stents are a wire mesh cylinder inserted into a clogged artery to hold it open. So kind of like the jaws of life, if you've ever seen like firefighters kind of crank open a door using the jaws of life when they have to rescue someone out of a car. It kind of is like opening up that artery to allow for either that clogged plaque to make its way through. It's just kind of like a mechanism or a material item that will hold it open. An angioplasty is kind of like a balloon, like they pump up a balloon on the inside of that clogged area and they inflate it to open up that vessel and break up that plaque. A stent and an angioplasty may be used in combination. So sometimes people will have an angioplasty done and then a stent inserted into that area. So treatments for arteriosclerotic plaque in coronary arteries. This is just a picture of what the doctor is doing there. I'm going to zoom in on the class screen here of what's going on. So the doctor is using a robot to manipulate the instruments. A TV screen is showing the operation in progress, and the movable arms hold those instruments. So the doctor right here is working on the person there. And then here's an example down here on the bottom right of the stent in the inflated balloon. So here's that mesh wiring that kind of holds that vein open on the bottom right. And then that blue part right there, it can kind of blow up like a balloon essentially if they put a balloon in there, and it kind of opens it up and breaks up that plaque. So some disorders. Heart failure is when the heart is no longer pumping properly. You can also have something called a pacemaker put in, if anybody heard of pacemaker. This is also can be a left ventricular assist device. A heart transplant can also be an option, either natural or artificial. So if you've ever heard of somebody being an organ donor, and have somebody else receiving that organ and doing a heart transplant. This is a replacement heart picture. It's kind of fascinating. They have a wireless energy transfer system, an external wireless transfer, or external wireless driver, an internal control, external battery, rechargeable internal battery, and they have a photograph of an artificial real heart here, an artificial heart. This is essentially showing that it's used to pump to the extremities, back to the heart, essentially like a little motor, a battery charged motor that they put in to replace the heart in order, because maybe there was some sort of cardiovascular disease or disorder that prevented that person from being able to pump blood efficiently. And the last slide. So how can we prevent cardiovascular disease? If we said it's the main cause of death in the Western world, what are some ways that we can prevent that? The use of tobacco products. So smoking, vaping, things like that are damaging your lungs. It's essentially making your body work harder to do the things that it normally does. The use of drug and alcohol abuse, The word is abuse there, but drugs, alcohol are preventing your body from working efficiently. Obesity and a sedentary lifestyle. Sedentary just means standing still, essentially not having an active lifestyle. And you don't have to be an athlete to have an active lifestyle, right? You could take your dog for a walk. You could, ride a stationary bike. You could leisurely ride your bike. There's just things about having an active lifestyle. Maybe that means parking further away in the Walmart parking lot so that you can get an extra steps in that day. Just having an active lifestyle. A poor diet. A poor diet just means that you're eating too much of nutrient depleted things. So too much junk food, not enough nutrients. Obviously, everything is good in moderation. Too much stress, right? So make sure that even as a college student or as you guys are going through this new learning style, stress can be a cause of some of those cardiovascular diseases. Over time, lots of stress on your body has physical symptoms. And then poor dental hygiene is another one. So make sure to brush those teeth. Get that plaque out of your mouth. Does anybody have any questions over today's PowerPoint?
An EKG and an ECG, are they the same thing?
Pretty much, yep. It's just the type of, so the question was an EKG and an ECG, are they the same thing? Sort of. They're both measuring the electric current of your heart, and it's just where it's attached to the person and the graph that comes out from it. ECG is the most common. What other questions can I answer at this time? Anything? All right, like I said, you have a week to get your assignment in. It's the Chapter 5 lecture assignment. It's on my Wartburg. It'll be due Monday. I should finish grading your tests here in the next couple of hours, which is exciting, so you'll be able to see those grades. We have lab on Wednesday, and I'll send out those instructions. So that's all I have for you guys today. Make sure you wipe your table down if you're in person, please.
Thank you.
We'll see you, Zoom.
Bye.
Bye.